Jamestown, Virginia, summer of 1640. 3 men are dragged in chains before a colonial court, caught after fleeing across the border into Maryland, and the judges are about to hand down a verdict that will echo for the next 386 years. 2 of the men are European, 1 is African. All 3 ran together, all 3 were captured together, and yet the court is about to punish them in completely different ways, based on nothing but the color of their skin. The African man's name is John Punch, and within minutes he will become the first person in the English colonies of North America sentenced to slavery for the rest of his natural life. He does not know it yet, but his blood is about to travel across nearly 4 centuries, through free children, through white landowning families, through Irish famine ships and Kenyan lakeside villages, until it lands, astonishingly, in the veins of the 44th President of the United States. This is not political commentary. This is not speculation dressed up as history. This is what genetic researchers actually found when they traced the maternal bloodline of Barack Obama. And what they uncovered is one of the strangest, most improbable stories that DNA has ever told about America itself. Stop and sit with that for a second, because the panic in that courtroom was real. John Punch was not a wealthy man pleading a technicality. He was a servant, likely still in his 20s, standing before judges who held absolute power over the rest of his life, watching 2 men who had run beside him, eaten beside him, and been captured beside him, walk away with a punishment that would eventually end. He alone was being told that his punishment would never end. There was no appeal process worth mentioning, no higher court to petition, no legal tradition anywhere in the English colonies that had ever handed down a sentence quite like this one before. In that single afternoon, in that single Jamestown courtroom, the entire future of race in America began to take shape, and the man standing at the center of it had no way of knowing that his blood, not his name, not his story, but his actual biological blood, would still matter to historians and geneticists nearly 4 centuries later. To understand why this moment in 1640 matters so much, you have to understand what colonial Virginia looked like at the time. Slavery, as a fixed, permanent, lifelong legal status, did not yet formally exist in English law. Africans brought to the colonies were often treated as indentured servants, bound for a set number of years, much like poor Europeans who sold years of their labor in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. It was a brutal system, but in theory at least, it had an endpoint. John Punch, along with a Scotsman named James Gregory and a Dutchman known as Victor, worked for a planter named Hugh Gwynn. In the summer of 1640, the 3 men ran. They fled north, aiming to escape their bondage entirely, only to be captured in Maryland and hauled back to Jamestown to answer to the Virginia General Court. The court's ruling has survived in the colonial records, and it is chilling in its simplicity. Gregory and Victor, the 2 European men, were sentenced to a whipping and an extension of their servitude. 1 additional year to their master and 3 more years to the colony itself. Painful, humiliating, but temporary. John Punch received a different sentence entirely. The court ordered that he serve his master, and his master's assigns for the time of his natural life, here or elsewhere. There was no ambiguity in the wording. There was no end date. John Punch had just become, in the eyes of colonial law, the first documented person in English North America condemned to slavery for life, purely because of his race. Historians who study early Virginia consider this the founding legal moment of race-based slavery in what would become the United States. Not a vague cultural drift over decades, but one specific ruling, on one specific day, that drew a hard line between servitude that ends and bondage that never does. What makes this so unsettling is how quickly the logic spread. Within 2 decades, Virginia lawmakers began writing Punch's punishment into the fabric of the colony's legal code. By 1661, the colony's laws explicitly distinguished between white and black servants who ran away, treating black runaways far more harshly. The following year, in 1662, Virginia passed a law declaring that the legal status of a child would follow the status of the mother, not the father, meaning that any child born to an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved from birth, regardless of who the father was. That single piece of legislation would go on to shape the entire architecture of American slavery for the next 200 years. It meant that an enslaved woman's children, no matter who fathered them, no matter whether the father was free, enslaved, white, or black, were born into bondage automatically, permanently, and hereditarily. It closed off almost every legal escape route that had briefly existed in the years right after Punch's sentencing. It is a sobering thought that Punch's own children were born free largely because they arrived just early enough before that 1662 law slammed the door shut behind them. It is almost impossible to overstate how much of the nation's later history traces back to that one courtroom decision involving 3 runaway servants and a furious planter named Hugh Gwynn. But here is the twist that almost nobody expects, the twist that turns this from a grim historical footnote into something genuinely extraordinary. John Punch, despite being condemned to a lifetime of bondage, apparently had children with a free white woman. Under the legal customs of the period, before the 1662 law locked everything into place, a child's freedom could still, in some circumstances, follow the mother's status rather than the father's. Punch's children were born free. They took the surname Bunch, and they grew up not as slaves but as free landowners in a colony that was rapidly hardening its racial boundaries around them. Think about the strangeness of that. The very man the law used to invent permanent hereditary slavery had descendants who slipped through the cracks of that same emerging system and lived as free people. His bloodline did not vanish into bondage. It persisted quietly, generation after generation, moving through Virginia farmland and into the frontier, mixing with other families, blending into communities that, over time, simply stopped remembering where it had all started. Fast forward roughly 370 years to 2012. A team of professional genealogists working with Ancestry. COM was conducting deep research into Barack Obama's family tree, and they made a discovery that stunned even the researchers themselves. It had long been assumed that if Obama had any connection to American slavery, it would show up somewhere on his father's side, since his father, Barack Obama Sr., was Kenyan. But his father's ancestry, rooted in the Luo community of Western Kenya, had no connection to the American slave trade at all. Nobody had thought to look closely at his mother's side, the Dunham family of Kansas, a lineage that appeared on the surface to be entirely European. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Genealogist Joseph Shumway and his colleagues traced Obama's maternal line back through Kansas, through the Midwest, and eventually into colonial Virginia, where the trail connected to a family called Bunch. DNA testing on living Bunch family members revealed something nobody expected. Clear evidence of sub-Saharan African ancestry, embedded in a family line that had been classified and had classified itself as white for generations. Working backward through marriage records, property deeds, and court documents, some of them dating to the 1600s, researchers connected the Bunch family to none other than John Punch, the same man whose 1640 court sentence had helped create the entire legal framework of American slavery. The research team did not rely on a single document or a single test result. They cross-checked land grants against parish records, matched surnames across multiple counties as families migrated westward out of Virginia, and compared the results against DNA samples voluntarily submitted by multiple living Bunch descendants scattered across different states, none of whom had ever met each other, yet all of whom carried the same unmistakable sub-Saharan genetic marker sitting inside family trees that had listed nothing but European surnames for generations, according to Ancestry. COM's own findings, President Obama is, by their calculation, the 11th great-grandson of John Punch. 11 generations, roughly 380 years. The first person in English America ever legally sentenced to slavery for life, connected by blood, not metaphor, not symbolism, actual documented biology, to the first black president in the history of the United States. Joseph Shumway later described it as one of the most remarkable connections his team had ever uncovered, calling Punch and Obama two of the most significant figures in African American history, bound together across nearly 4 centuries. Now, intellectual honesty matters here. And the researchers themselves were careful to include a caveat that deserves just as much attention as the headline finding. There is a documented gap in the paper trail, somewhere in the chain connecting John Punch to his presumed son, a free man who by his early 20s owned 450 acres and grew tobacco in early Virginia. A key record is missing. Genealogist Elizabeth Shown Mills, a former president of the American Society of Genealogists, has pointed out that the surviving records pick back up a generation later, when one of Punch's grandsons petitioned a Virginia court for permission to marry a white woman and was denied, almost certainly because he was visibly of mixed-race heritage. That denial is its own small tragedy buried inside a larger one, a free, land-owning man still boxed in by the very racial system his grandfather's punishment had helped invent. But the missing link in the paper trail means the John Punch connection, while strongly supported by circumstantial and genetic evidence, cannot be called an absolute, unbroken document-by-document certainty. What is not in question is the DNA itself. The Bunch family's African ancestry is real, it is documented, and it sits directly inside Barack Obama's maternal line. While researchers were tracing that thread, they uncovered something else buried in the same branch of the family tree, something that makes the whole picture even more complicated. Census records from Kentucky in 1850 show that one of Obama's great-great-great-great-grandfathers, a man named George Washington Overall, legally owned 2 enslaved people, a 15-year-old girl and a 25-year-old man. Other records from the same period show that one of his great-great-great-great-grandmothers, Mary Duval, owned 2 more enslaved individuals, a 60-year-old man and a 58-year-old woman. In other words, on one branch of Barack Obama's mother's family tree sits a man descended from the first person ever legally enslaved for life in English America. On another branch of that very same maternal line sit people who owned enslaved human beings themselves. Both threads, the enslaved and the enslaver, run through the same mother's bloodline, converging in a single person born in Honolulu in 1961. Neither the overall family nor the Duval family appears to have had any awareness of the other branch sitting elsewhere on the same tree, the one running back to a man their own relatives might once have looked down on as beneath consideration. That is the strange arithmetic of American genealogy. After enough generations pass, the oppressor and the once enslaved end up sharing descendants without either branch ever knowing the other existed. When the story broke, Obama's campaign spokesman at the time, Bill Burton, addressed it directly, saying that the president's ancestors were representative of America itself, noting that while one relative owned slaves, another fought for the Union in the Civil War, and calling it a genuine measure of progress that the descendant of a slaveholder would go on to marry a student from Kenya and produce a son who would become a candidate for president of the United States. The maternal line does not stop at slavery and its contradictions, though. It stretches further back across the Atlantic into a story of hunger, desperation, and survival that has nothing to do with America at all. Obama's third great-grandfather on his mother's side was a man named Falmouth Kearney, born in a small village in the Irish Midlands called Moneygall, in what is now County Offaly. Kearney's family had, generations earlier, been reasonably prosperous. Historical research into the Kearneys of Moneygall shows that during the 1760s and 1780s, family members ran a respected wig-making business in Dublin, moving in circles that brought them into contact with some of the more influential figures of the period. But prosperity in 18th century Ireland did not protect anyone from what came in the 1840s. Between 1845 and roughly 1851, the Great Famine tore through Ireland, triggered by repeated failures of the potato crop, the staple food for millions of poor and working Irish families. Over 1 million people died. Over 1 million more fled the country entirely, boarding overcrowded, disease-ridden ships bound for North America, in search of anything resembling a future. Falmouth Kearney was one of them. Passenger records confirm that he crossed the Atlantic and landed in New York in 1850, arriving into a family line that, on the American side, was already fully established. He was the last of Obama's maternal ancestors to make that crossing, the final new arrival in a bloodline that would otherwise already be planted in American soil. In May of 2011, genealogists announced they had identified President Obama's closest living relatives in Ireland, a small group of people in County Tipperary, not far from Moneygall, connected to him through the Kearney line. That same month, Obama traveled to Ireland as a sitting president and visited Moneygall itself, walking through the village his ancestor had left more than a century and a half earlier, meeting distant cousins and famously stopping for a pint at the local pub. It was one of those rare moments where a piece of deep genealogical research turned into a genuinely public, televised, human moment. A president standing in the exact village his great-great-great-grandfather had fled during one of the worst famines in modern European history. None of this, of course, tells the whole story because half of Barack Obama's ancestry runs in a completely different direction, through an entirely separate continent, an entirely separate history, with no connection at all to Virginia, Kansas, or Ireland. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was born in 1936 near Lake Victoria in western Kenya into the Luo community, one of the largest ethnic groups in East Africa, known for a rich tradition of oral storytelling and tightly bound extended family networks. His paternal grandfather was a man named Hussein Onyango Obama, born in a village called Kanyadian. Tracing the line back further, through names preserved not in courthouse ledgers but in generations of spoken family memory, Obama Sr.'s own account in his son's memoir lists ancestors going back through Onyango's father Obama, his grandfather Opio, and further still through Okoth and Obongo. This is a lineage recorded almost entirely through oral tradition, the kind of ancestral memory that many African communities preserved with remarkable precision long before Western documentation ever existed in the region. Where the Virginia side of Obama's family tree survives because clerks wrote names into ledgers, wills, and court dockets, the Kenyan side survives because Luo elders repeated names aloud, generation after generation, at gatherings and around fires, treating memory itself as a form of record-keeping every bit as durable as ink on paper. Two completely different systems for preserving the past, one built on parchment and courtroom bureaucracy, the other built on spoken word and communal memory, and both of them, remarkably, converging on the same person born in a Honolulu hospital in August of 1961. Obama Sr. left Kenya as a young man to study in the United States, arriving at the University of Hawaii as part of a wave of ambitious East African students during the optimistic early years after decolonization, men who believed Western education could help rebuild and modernize their newly independent nations. It was there, at the University of Hawaii, that he met a young woman from Kansas named Stanley Ann Dunham. Stanley Ann Dunham was born in Wichita in 1942, the daughter of Stanley Armour Dunham and Madeline Lee Payne, a couple whose own ancestry ran through English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and German lines, almost entirely traceable through the American Midwest. On paper, before any DNA testing had ever taken place, this looked like an entirely ordinary white American family, the kind of ancestry millions of Americans would describe in exactly the same vague, unremarkable terms. Nobody in that family, as far as the historical record shows, had any idea that buried inside their supposedly all-European lineage was a direct line back to John Punch and the very first legal act of race-based slavery in the English colonies. That is precisely what makes the discovery so significant beyond Obama himself. His mother's family did not carry some family legend or whispered rumor about a hidden ancestor. They believed, as sincerely as any family can believe anything about its own past, that they were simply white, Midwestern, and European in origin. The DNA did not ask what they believed. It simply told the truth that centuries of documentation, self-identification, and quiet forgetting had buried. Genealogist William Adams Wright Wiesner, who has produced detailed ancestral breakdowns for numerous American public figures, calculated Obama's approximate ancestral composition using traditional documentary genealogy, arriving at figures showing roughly half Luo heritage from his father's side, and on his mother's side, a mix of English, Scottish, Irish, German, Welsh, Swiss, and even a trace of French ancestry, each contributing a small, precise fraction to the whole. Those percentages, though, are only the surface. They describe geography and nationality. They do not, by themselves, capture the buried genetic thread of sub-Saharan African ancestry sitting quietly inside that supposedly all-European maternal branch, the thread that only surfaced because researchers happened to test living members of the Bunch family and noticed something that did not match the family's assumed history at all. Biographer David Marinis, who spent years researching Obama's early life, once observed that because of his skin color and his father's background, Obama was widely categorized as African American. Yet culturally, he did not grow up steeped in that identity in the way many black Americans did. He had, in Marinis's words, to learn it, to piece together an identity that his own country had already assigned to him based purely on appearance, while the deeper genetic reality underneath that appearance turned out to be far more tangled than any simple label could hold. A man raised largely by his white Kansan grandparents in Hawaii, shaped by an absent Kenyan father and an anthropologist mother who spent years living and working in Indonesia, carrying inside him, unknowingly for most of his life, the blood of the first person legally enslaved for life in English North America. It is difficult to imagine a single human genetic profile that more thoroughly compresses the entire contradictory story of the United States into one bloodline: the founding crime of racial slavery, the famine that emptied Ireland and refilled America, the oral traditions of Luo elders on the shores of an African lake, the quiet, unremarkable Kansas farm families who had no idea what they were carrying. What this case reveals goes well beyond one famous individual. It exposes something researchers in genetic genealogy have been documenting with increasing frequency as DNA testing has become more accessible and more affordable across the general public. Millions of American families who have identified as purely white for generations are discovering, often to their genuine shock, some percentage of African, Native American, or other ancestry buried in lines they assumed were entirely European. This is not a fringe phenomenon. It is a direct, measurable consequence of exactly what happened to the Bunch family after John Punch's children were born free. Because race in colonial and early American law was never actually a clean biological category. It was a legal fiction, built court ruling by court ruling, starting with exactly the kind of decision handed down against John Punch in 1640, then hardened by the 1662 law tying a child's status to the mother rather than the father. Families that fell on the free, lighter-skinned side of that fiction over enough generations simply began identifying and being identified as white, regardless of what remained buried in their actual genetic history. DNA does not recognize any of those legal categories. It does not care what a family called itself on a census form in 1850 or what a courthouse clerk wrote down in a ledger in 1780. It simply records what actually happened, generation after generation, union after union, and waits patiently for someone with a testing kit and a genealogical database large enough to finally read it. That is exactly what happened with Barack Obama's ancestry. A team of researchers spent roughly 500 hours over the course of 2 years combing through fragile colonial documents, faded property deeds, marriage records, and census ledgers, cross-referencing all of it against modern DNA samples taken from living descendants, before they were confident enough to publish what they had found. What they produced was not just a celebrity genealogy chart. It was a case study in exactly how thoroughly the racial categories Americans have lived inside for 4 centuries fail to match the biological reality underneath them. John Punch ran from bondage in 1640 and was punished with a sentence that helped invent permanent race-based slavery in English America. His children were born free because of the legal status of their mother, and their descendants quietly built lives as landowners in a colony that was rapidly writing racial hierarchy into its laws. Their bloodline moved forward through the centuries, unnoticed, unremarked upon, through Virginia, into Kentucky, into Kansas, absorbed into families who came to think of themselves as simply, unremarkably American and white. Meanwhile, an entirely separate bloodline moved forward on the other side of the Atlantic, through Luo villages on the edge of Lake Victoria, preserved not in paper, but in memory and story, until a young man from that lineage crossed an ocean to study in Hawaii and met a young woman from Kansas whose family carried, without knowing it, the genetic legacy of the very system that had once defined his own ancestors' place in the world by force. Their son grew up to become the President of the United States, and it was only through the patient, painstaking work of genealogists and geneticists, working through 500 hours of documents and DNA samples from distant living relatives, that anyone learned just how directly his own body carried the entire arc of that story inside it. Not as metaphor, not as poetic interpretation. As documented biology, verified by DNA testing, sitting quietly in a bloodline, nobody had thought to examine that closely until curiosity and modern genetic science finally caught up with 400 years of buried history. And that leaves an unavoidable question hanging over every family that has ever confidently filled out a box on a census form describing their race. If a Kansas farming family with no rumor, no legend, and no reason to suspect anything unusual about their ancestry could be carrying a direct genetic line back to the first person ever legally enslaved for life in English America, how many other families across the country are walking around today with a version of the exact same hidden story buried inside them, waiting only for someone to finally run the test? Somewhere right now, in a living room or a kitchen table conversation, someone is opening an envelope from a genetic testing company, scrolling through a phone screen full of unfamiliar percentages, and quietly discovering that everything their family believed about itself for generations was only ever half the picture. That is the real legacy of John Punch's courtroom sentence in 1640. Not just the laws it inspired, not just the centuries of injustice those laws enabled, but the simple biological fact that blood does not obey borders, categories, or courtroom rulings. It moves forward, regardless, patiently, silently, through free children and slaveholding families and famine ships and Kenyan villages alike, until science finally catches up and reads what history tried so hard to keep hidden.